The air in the core nexus tasted of chilled, recycled oxygen and the faint, hot plastic scent of quantum processing. It was an antiseptic atmosphere, precisely calibrated, a world away from the chaotic, rain-slicked city visible 27 floors below. Alistair Finch preferred it this way: control, precision, the absence of variables. His reflection, a severe silhouette in the polished chrome of a server rack, stared back at him, the sharp lines of his suit a testament to the order he had imposed on his universe. He ended the call that had just dismantled a rival's decade of work with a quiet, final tap on his phone's screen. "It's done," he'd said, the two words carrying the weight of a corporate guillotine. Beside him, a much smaller reflection wavered. His daughter, Lily, 7 years old and silent as a shadow, had her small palm pressed against the glass panel of the central processing unit. Her breath fogged a tiny circle on the cold surface, a fleeting imperfection in his sterile world. He had to bring her tonight. Her nanny had called in with a sudden fever, and Alistair did not permit last-minute disruptions to his schedule. He tolerated Lily's presence the way he tolerated a necessary but inconvenient software update. He turned, his gaze softening by a calculated, almost imperceptible degree. "Lily, don't touch the glass." His voice was not unkind, merely devoid of warmth, the same tone he used to address his executive board. She drew her hand back without looking at him, her attention still captive to the rhythmic, hypnotic blinking of 1,000 tiny blue and green lights within the machine's heart. It was in that moment of renewed, humming silence that he heard it. A click. Soft, but utterly alien in this environment. It was the sound of a latch, a sound of manual operation in a fully automated sanctum. Alistair's blood ran cold. His head snapped toward the source of the sound, the far side of the circular chamber, a section of server racks that housed the company's most sensitive R&D data. He pulled Lily behind him, his body instinctively forming a shield. No one, not his chief technology officer, not his most trusted board members, no one, entered the Nexus without his direct, biometric authorization. He tapped the face of his watch, and a security feed bloomed to life on its screen. The camera angle was from above, looking down. The image showed an old man, stooped and thin in a gray janitor's uniform, his back to the feed. A rolling cart with a yellow bucket and a mop stood a few feet away, a ridiculous Trojan horse in this digital fortress. The man had one of the server blades slid partially out of its housing. He wasn't pulling at wires or trying to force a component free. He was just looking, his head tilted with a strange academic curiosity, one gnarled finger tracing the intricate pathways on a circuit board, careful not to touch it. Fury, cold and pure, washed through Alistair. It wasn't the fury of a man fearing theft. It was the outrage of a god whose temple had been defiled by a groundskeeper. This was not just a breach of protocol. It was an act of blasphemy against the institution of his success. He strode forward, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the sound-dampening floor. Lily trailed in his wake, her small hand clutching the back of his suit jacket. He keyed in the override, and the pneumatic door hissed open, the sudden change in air pressure making Lily flinch. The old man started, turning with the slow, pained movement of someone whose joints had long since betrayed them. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes a pale, watery blue, clouded with a weariness that seemed ancient. He held up his hands, palms open, a gesture of placation, of surrender. I am sorry, sir," he began, his voice raspy, laced with a thick Slavic accent. "I was just cleaning. I see the dust." Alistair's eyes were chips of ice. "You were cleaning," he repeated, his voice dangerously low, "inside a Tier 4, biometrically sealed server rack, with your bare hands." He took another step, invading the man's space, forcing him to shuffle backward. "Do you have any idea what this equipment is? What it costs? what it does. The man shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. No, sir. It is very beautiful, like a city at night. The poetic observation only stoked Alistair's rage. It was the nonsensical rambling of an imbecile. Give me your ID, now. The janitor fumbled in his pocket, his hands trembling as he produced a laminated card. Alistair snatched it. Ivan Morozov, sanitation engineer. He scoffed at the title. Morozov, you're fired. Get your card and get out of my building. You'll be met by security at the lobby. They will ensure you don't have anything that doesn't belong to you. Ivan's face crumpled. The fear was replaced by a profound, hollowed-out despair. Sir, please. I need this job. It is all I have. I did not touch anything. I swear on my life. I was just looking. You looked at the wrong thing, Alistair said, his voice final. He turned his back on the man, a dismissal more profound than any further words. He was already composing the email in his head, a scathing directive to his head of security. He would make an example of this man. As he turned, he felt a tug on his jacket. It was Lily. She had stepped out from behind him and was staring at Ivan. Her expression was one he had never seen before. It wasn't fear or shyness. It was a look of intense, focused recognition, as if she were seeing a ghost from a life she'd never lived. Her lips, usually set in a silent, placid line, parted. And then she spoke. It was the first word she had uttered in 6 months, not since the day her mother had died. It was not Daddy. It was not hello. It was a single, perfectly pronounced Russian word, spoken in a child's clear, high-pitched voice, a word that sliced through the humming silence of the server room and struck Alistair Finch like a physical blow. Dedushka. The word hung in the air, an impossible artifact. Grandfather. Ivan froze, his watery blue eyes locking onto Lily's. His whole body went rigid, and his breath hitched. The despair on his face was washed away by a wave of utter, soul-shaking disbelief. He stared at the small girl with the wide, dark eyes, and for a moment, the cavernous, sterile server room seemed to melt away, replaced by the ghost of a sunlit dacha, the scent of pine needles, and the sound of a language he thought he had lost forever. Alistair stood rooted to the spot, paralyzed. His mind, a fortress of logic and calculation, was short-circuiting. He knew that word. His late wife, Anya, had spoken it often, referring to her own father, a man Alistair had never met, a man who had died long before Lily was born. Anya had been the only source of Russian in Lily's life, and she had been gone for 2 years. Lily had been just 5. She shouldn't know that word. She shouldn't know it with that accent, with that familiar lilt. He looked from his daughter's impossibly solemn face to the janitor's stunned, tear-filled eyes. The neat, orderly world he had built for himself, a world of predictable inputs and profitable outputs, had just been fractured by a single, inexplicable variable. The word echoed again in his mind, Dedushka. And for the first time in a very long time, Alistair Finch had no idea what to do next. He didn't fire him. The words, so close to his lips, simply evaporated. He couldn't force them out, not with his daughter's small hand, now protectively gripping the old man's worn trousers, her eyes still fixed on Ivan's face. Alistair cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the charged silence. Just get out, he managed, the words lacking their earlier venom. Leave the cart. Go to the lobby and wait for me. Ivan, still looking at Lily as if she were an apparition, simply nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing. He shuffled past Alistair, his gaze lingering on the child, until the pneumatic door hissed shut behind him, leaving Alistair alone with his daughter and the humming, blinking machines that suddenly felt less like the heart of his empire and more like silent, alien witnesses. Lily let go of his jacket. She didn't look at him. She walked back to the glass panel and placed her hand on it again, her attention returning to the lights, as if the monumental event of her speaking had never occurred. But it had. Alistair felt its aftershock resonating in his bones. He led her out of the nexus, his hand on her shoulder feeling strangely heavy, disconnected. The walk to his penthouse office, usually a triumphant march through the monument to his ambition, was a disorienting journey through a suddenly unfamiliar landscape. The polished marble floors seemed colder, the towering glass walls more isolating. His office was a minimalist masterpiece of glass, steel, and black leather. A single priceless abstract painting hung on one wall, its chaotic slash of red a stark contrast to the rigid order of the room. He sat Lily down on a supple leather couch that was worth more than a small car and put a tablet in her hands. She accepted it without a word, her face immediately illuminated by the cool glow of a cartoon. It was their usual routine, a transactional exchange of technology for silence. Tonight, it felt hollow. Alistair walked to the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the sprawling, glittering expanse of the city. He loosened his tie, a rare breach of his own personal code. His mind raced, trying to process the anomaly. He replayed the scene over and over. Ivan Morozov, a name that meant nothing. A sanitation engineer, an old man who should have been nothing more than a footnote in a termination report. But Lily had called him grandfather. Why? A coincidence? A misremembered word from a video she'd watched? He dismissed the idea immediately. Lily didn't watch videos with Russian dialogue. Anya had been meticulous about speaking only English to her once she started preschool, wanting her to integrate seamlessly, to have every advantage. Anya. The thought of her was a dull, persistent ache he had learned to wall off. She had been the one variable he'd allowed into his life, a whirlwind of warmth, passion, and a language that sounded like poetry on her lips. Her death from a sudden aneurysm had been a brutal, illogical event that defied all his attempts at control. In the aftermath, he had done what he always did. He'd compartmentalized. He'd packed away her books, her clothes, her music. He had excised the Russian part of their lives, believing it was the source of the pain, a constant reminder of his loss. And in the process, he had packed away a part of his daughter. Her silence had begun a few months after the funeral, a creeping fog that had eventually enveloped her completely. Therapists had used words like selective mutism and trauma response. They had suggested he engage with her memories of her mother, to talk about Anya, to surround her with familiar things. He had tried, but the words felt like ash in his mouth. It was easier to build his empire higher, to create a fortress so tall and impenetrable that the grief couldn't reach them. Now a crack had appeared in the foundation, made by a frightened old janitor and a single Russian word. He picked up his desk phone and buzzed his head of security. "Matthews, I need a full background check run, immediately." "On who, sir?" "Ivan Morozov, an employee, sanitation." "Problem, sir?" "Just do it," Alistair snapped. "I want everything, employment history, immigration status, family, financials, everything. I want it on my desk by morning." He hung up and stared out at the city again. This was how he solved problems. With data. With information. He would dissect this Ivan Morozov, lay his life out on a spreadsheet, and find the logical explanation. He would reassert control, but as he stood there, watching the distant, impersonal streams of headlights, a sliver of doubt, cold and sharp, pierced his certainty. What if the explanation wasn't logical? What if it was something else entirely? Something that couldn't be quantified or controlled? He glanced over at his daughter. She was still engrossed in her cartoon, her face bathed in shifting colored light. She was a stranger to him, a tiny, silent enigma living in his home. He provided for her, protected her, but he didn't know her. He had never realized it so starkly until tonight. The thought was more terrifying than any corporate espionage or market downturn. He had built an empire of glass and steel, but his own house was a fragile, silent ruin. And he had no idea how to fix it. He spent the night in his office, unable to face the sterile silence of his penthouse apartment. He sent Lily home with his driver, who doubled as a bodyguard, and immersed himself in work, the familiar rhythm of contracts and projections a temporary balm. But his focus was shattered. Every few minutes the old man's face would flash in his mind, followed by the sound of Lily's voice. Dedushka. Morning came, gray and indifferent. Matthews delivered the file personally. It was thin, which was in itself a curiosity. Alistair dismissed him and opened it, a cup of black coffee steaming at his elbow. The first page was a standard employee profile. Ivan Morozov, age 68, citizen of the Russian Federation, permanent resident, green card holder. Address, a tenement building in the city's poorest district. Employed by the third-party cleaning service Alistair's company contracted, assigned to Finch Tower for the last 3 years. No disciplinary actions, no commendations. He was on paper, practically invisible. The next page was the immigration file. Arrived in the United States 15 years ago. Sponsored by a distant cousin, now deceased. Profession listed on his visa application. Mechanical engineer. Alistair's eyebrows rose. A mechanical engineer mopping floors. Not unheard of, but a steep fall. The following pages were a patchwork of data points, a life pieced together from public records and database searches. He'd worked a series of low-wage jobs: dishwasher, factory worker, night watchman. No criminal record, no credit history to speak of, just a small checking account with a balance that was barely enough to cover a month's rent. There was a section on family. It was almost empty. Marital status: widowed. Spouse: Elena Morozova, deceased. The cause of death was not listed. And then, a single, devastating line item under dependents. Daughter: Anya Morozova, deceased. Alistair felt the air leave his lungs. He read the name again, and then a third time, as if staring at it long enough would change the letters. Anya. It was a common name. It had to be a coincidence. It was a statistical improbability so vast as to be nonsensical. His Anya had been an orphan, raised in a state-run institution in St. Petersburg. She had told him so herself. Her parents, she'd said, had died in a car accident when she was a baby. She had no one. It was one of the things that had drawn him to her. They were both self-made, unburdened by the messy entanglements of family. He thumbed through the file, his heart hammering against his ribs. He found a grainy, black-and-white copy of Ivan's visa photograph, taken 15 years ago. The man was younger, his face less etched with sorrow, but the eyes were the same. Pale, intelligent, haunted. There was nothing else. No picture of his wife, no picture of his daughter. Just names on a form. A dead wife and a dead daughter named Anya. Alistair stood up and paced the length of his office. His mind, usually a seamless engine of logic, was seizing. He was connecting dots that couldn't possibly connect. He was building a narrative that belonged in a cheap paperback novel, not in his life. His wife, the love of his life, the mother of his child, had been a liar? It was impossible. She was the most honest, open person he had ever known. And yet, Dedushka. Lily's word was the linchpin, the piece that held the impossible theory together. How could she know that word? How could she say it to that specific man? He remembered Anya talking about her father, but the stories were always vague, like fairy tales. He was a brilliant engineer, she'd said. He could build anything. He taught her to see the world not as it was, but as a series of interlocking systems, a beautiful machine. He had a workshop that smelled of sawdust and ozone. These were the memories of a child, not the fabrications of a liar. Alistair's hand trembled as he picked up the phone. "Matthews, I need more. I want to know everything about this man's daughter, the one named Anya. When did she die? How? I want a death certificate. I want to know where she's buried, and find out everything you can about the wife, Elena." "Sir, that might require digging into Russian records. It could take time, and it might get complicated." "I don't care," Alistair said, his voice strained. "I'm paying you to handle complications. Do it." He hung up and sank into his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He looked at the thin file on his desk. Ivan Morozov. A ghost who had drifted through the background of his life for 3 years. A man whose existence had been utterly irrelevant. Now that man threatened to unravel the entire tapestry of Alistair's past, to rewrite the history of his marriage, of his own daughter. He thought of Ivan, waiting in the lobby. He had told him to wait. It was now 8 a.m. The man had presumably been sitting on a hard bench all night. Alistair felt a pang of something he couldn't identify. It wasn't pity. It was a reluctant acknowledgement. A shared connection, however impossible. He buzzed his assistant. "Is there a janitor named Ivan Morozov in the main lobby?" "Yes, sir. Security has him in the waiting area. He's been there all night. They've been asking me what to do with him." "Tell security to let him go home," Alistair said, "and tell payroll to continue his salary. He's not fired. He's on paid leave until further notice." "Yes, sir." He hung up. Paid leave. He was paying the man who might have been his father-in-law, a man his wife had told him was dead. The absurdity of it was staggering. He looked out the window again. The city was fully awake now, a frantic, teeming ecosystem of commerce and ambition, his world. But he felt completely detached from it, as if he were observing it from behind a thick wall of glass. He was no longer the master of this universe. He was just a man with a ghost in his machine. The days that followed were a blur of managed chaos. Alistair moved through his meetings, his negotiations, his multi-million-dollar decisions, like an automaton. He was present in body, but his mind was elsewhere, caught in a loop of speculation and memory. He scrutinized every recollection of Anya, searching for cracks in the facade. Had there been moments of hesitation? Slips of the tongue? He remembered her occasional bouts of deep, inconsolable sadness, which he had always attributed to a melancholy Russian soul. He remembered her aversion to talking about her childhood in any specific detail. At the time, he'd respected her privacy, seeing it as a symptom of a difficult upbringing in the orphanage system. Now, every vague answer seemed like a potential deception. At home, the silence was different. It was no longer empty. It was heavy with unspoken questions. Lily had not spoken another word since that night. She remained in her quiet bubble, but Alistair found himself watching her constantly, searching her face for some sign of Anya, for some clue to the mystery. He would catch her looking at the door, as if expecting someone. Was she waiting for Ivan? One evening, he sat with her in the living room, a cavernous space with a white grand piano that no one ever played. He knelt in front of her, taking her small hands in his. "Lily," he said softly, "the other night, in the office, the cleaning man, what did you say to him?" She stared at him with her mother's dark, soulful eyes, her expression unreadable. She gave no response, simply pulling her hands away and returning her attention to the picture book in her lap. The wall was back up. He had lost his chance. A week later, Matthews delivered the second file. This one was thicker. Alistair locked his office door and spread the contents across his vast, empty desk. There were documents with Cyrillic script, translated and notarized. There were grainy photographs. It was the story of a life, and it was a tragedy. Ivan Morozov had been a prominent aerospace engineer in Moscow. There was a photo of him from the 1980s, standing proudly next to a piece of machinery for a satellite, a confident, smiling man in his prime. He was married to Elena, a schoolteacher. There was a wedding photo. She was beautiful, with a kind, gentle face. And they had a daughter, Anya. The file contained a copy of her birth certificate. It also contained a school photograph of a little girl with dark pigtails and a missing front tooth. Her eyes were wide and serious. They were Lily's eyes. Alistair felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He kept reading. The tragedy began with the fall of the Soviet Union. The research institute where Ivan worked was defunded, its projects scrapped. He was a man of genius, suddenly rendered obsolete. He struggled, taking on menial jobs to support his family. Then, Elena fell ill, a rare form of leukemia. They spent their life savings on treatments, but it was no use. The file contained her death certificate dated 17 years ago. Ivan was left alone with his teenage daughter. Anya was brilliant, just like her father. She excelled in school, dreaming of studying abroad, of escaping the decay and disillusionment that surrounded them. This was where the story took a dark turn, pieced together from police reports and witness statements that Matthew's contacts had dredged up. Anya became involved with a young man from a dangerous crowd. Ivan disapproved vehemently. There were arguments, fights. Anya, fiercely independent and rebellious, refused to listen. One night, the young man was involved in a deal that went bad. There was violence. Anya was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The official report was vague, listing her death as the result of a criminal altercation. She was 17. The file contained a copy of her death certificate. Alistair stared at it, his vision blurring. It was real. Ivan Morozov's daughter, Anya, had died in Moscow almost 2 decades ago. So his wife wasn't Ivan's daughter. The entire theory, the impossible connection. It was all just a spectacular, painful coincidence. He felt a wave of relief so profound it almost made him dizzy. Anya hadn't lied to him. His past was secure. But the relief was immediately followed by a cold, hollow feeling. If his Anya wasn't Ivan's daughter, then the mystery remained. In fact, it was deeper now. Lily's word was no longer a half-remembered truth. It was a genuine enigma, a message from a place he couldn't comprehend. And what of Ivan? Alistair looked at the documents again. This quiet, unassuming janitor had suffered an unimaginable series of losses. He had lost his career, his country, his wife, and his child. And yet, for 3 years he had shown up to work every night, mopping the floors of the building that represented a world of success he could now only dream of. He had done so with quiet dignity, until he had made the mistake of looking too closely at one of its machines, a machine that perhaps reminded him of the man he used to be. Alistair felt a sudden, unfamiliar surge of empathy. It was an uncomfortable, disorienting sensation. He had always viewed the world through the lens of strength and weakness, success and failure. Ivan Morozov was, by all of Alistair's metrics, a failure. But the story in this file was not one of failure. It was one of survival against overwhelming odds. He picked up his phone, his decision made before he was even fully aware of making it. "Get me Ivan Morozov's home number." A few minutes later he was dialing, the phone feeling slick in his hand. It rang 4 times, and he was about to hang up when a voice answered, hesitant and raspy. Da. "Mr. Morozov? This is Alistair Finch." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Alistair could hear the sound of shallow breathing. "Mr. Finch," Ivan finally said, his voice laced with confusion and apprehension. I was told I am on leave." "You are," Alistair said. "I'm not calling about your job. Not directly. I was hoping I was wondering if I could meet with you. Another silence. Meet with me? Why? I'd like to talk. About what happened the other night. And about my daughter, he added silently. And about your daughter. It can be anywhere you choose, Alistair added, sensing the man's reluctance. I can come to you. This seemed to surprise Ivan even more. You would come here? Yes. Ivan gave him the address, the same tenement building from the file. They agreed to meet the next day. After he hung up, Alistair swiveled his chair to face the window. He was stepping off the map, leaving the comfortable territory of data and balance sheets and entering the messy, unpredictable world of human connection. He was doing it for Lily, he told himself. He needed to understand what had happened. But as he looked down at the photo of the smiling engineer and the school picture of the little girl with his daughter's eyes, he knew it was for more than that. It was for the ghost of Anya Morozova, a girl who died too young in a faraway city. And it was for the old man who had lost everything but had somehow kept going. The tenement building was even more depressing in person than it had been in his imagination. It was a crumbling brick monolith, stained with years of pollution, smelling of damp and despair. The lobby was dimly lit, the tiled floor cracked and grimy. Alistair, in his tailored Italian suit, felt as out of place as a flamingo in a coal mine. He ignored the curious, resentful stares from the other tenants and took the rickety, groaning elevator to the 5th floor. Evan's apartment was at the end of a long, narrow hallway. The door was painted a faded, peeling brown. Alistair knocked, and after a moment the door opened a few inches, held by a security chain. Ivan's pale blue eye peered out. Seeing Alistair, he seemed to fumble with the chain before opening the door fully. He was wearing simple trousers and a clean but frayed cardigan. The apartment behind him was tiny, barely more than a single room, but it was meticulously clean. The main space served as a living room and bedroom, with a neatly made cot against one wall. A small table with 2 wooden chairs stood by the window, which looked out onto a brick wall. A tiny alcove held a hot plate, a sink, and a mini fridge. There was no television. The only decoration was a small, framed photograph on the bedside table and a well-worn chessboard set up on a small crate. "Mr. Finch," Ivan said, his voice hushed. "Please, come in." Alistair stepped inside, feeling unnaturally large in the cramped space. Ivan closed the door behind him. "Can I offer you something? Tea?" "No, thank you," Alistair said, his eyes scanning the room. He saw the photograph on the table. It was the wedding picture from the file, of Ivan and his wife Elena. Next to it was another, smaller frame, holding the school picture of the girl with Lily's eyes. Ivan followed his gaze. "My wife," he said softly, "and my daughter. My Anya." He said the name with a reverence that was almost painful to hear. Alistair's throat felt tight. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, the words feeling inadequate. Ivan gave a small, sad smile. "It was a long time ago, but for a parent, it is never a long time ago." He gestured to one of the chairs at the table. "Please." Alistair sat. Ivan sat opposite him. They were quiet for a moment, the only sound the faint hiss of a radiator in the corner. "Mr. Finch," Ivan began, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "About the other night, I want to apologize again. It was a moment of weakness. I have not seen such complex engineering in many years. It reminded me of my old life. It was foolish. I will understand if you have changed your mind about my job." "I haven't changed my mind," Alistair said. "That's not why I'm here. I'm here because of my daughter." Ivan looked up, his expression shifting from apprehension to confusion. "The little girl." "Yes, Lily. What she said to you. The word she used." Ivan's gaze drifted to the window, as if looking back in time. "Dedushka," he whispered. "I have not heard that word spoken to me in almost 20 years." She's never said it before, Alistair said, leaning forward slightly. My wife was Russian. She died 2 years ago. Lily hasn't spoken at all in months. That word was the first thing she has said, and she said it to you. I need to understand why. Ivan looked back at him, his pale eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful wisdom. Mr. Finch, what is there to understand? She is a child who has lost her mother. I am an old man who has lost everyone. Perhaps a child's heart sees things that our eyes cannot. Sees what? Alistair pressed. That's not an explanation. It's a poem. Ivan sighed, a long, weary sound. I do not have an explanation for you. I only know what I felt. When she looked at me, it was as if my own Anya was looking at me from across time. It was a miracle. A beautiful, painful miracle. He fell silent, lost in the memory. Alistair realized he wasn't going to get a logical answer from this man. Ivan operated on a different plane, one governed by faith and feeling, not by data and proof. But there was another question, one that had been gnawing at him since he'd seen the file. Your daughter, Alistair said, his voice softer now. The photograph. My daughter Lily. She looks just like her. For the first time, Ivan's composure seemed to crack. His eyes filled with tears, and he looked down at his trembling hands. Yes, he choked out. I saw that too. When I saw your little girl, it was like seeing the ghost of my own child. It was a shock to my heart. The raw, undisguised grief in the old man's voice was like a physical blow. Alistair had built his entire adult life around the avoidance of such messy, powerful emotions. He didn't know how to respond. He just sat there, in the silence of the tiny, clean room, as the old engineer wept for a daughter who had died half a lifetime ago. A connection had been made, not of blood or logic, but of shared loss. Alistair Finch, the master of the universe, and Ivan Morozov, the janitor, were united in their grief. They were just two fathers, haunted by the ghosts of the women they had loved. Alistair stayed for almost an hour. He didn't press Ivan for more answers. Instead, he found himself asking about Ivan's life as an engineer, about the projects he had worked on. Ivan, wiping his eyes, began to talk. As he spoke about satellite guidance systems and thrust vectoring, a transformation occurred. The stooped, weary janitor faded away, replaced by a confident, brilliant scientist. His eyes lit up. His hands moved animatedly, sketching complex diagrams in the air. He was a man recalling his own soul. Alistair listened, fascinated. He understood this language. This was the world of systems, of problems and solutions. He saw the genius that had been buried under years of tragedy and menial labor. When he finally stood to leave, the atmosphere in the room had changed. The tension was gone, replaced by a fragile, tentative rapport. Mr. Morozov, Alistair said at the door. The server you were looking at, what did you see? Ivan hesitated. I should not have been there. Tell me anyway. The cooling system, Ivan said. The auxiliary pump for the primary coolant loop. The pressure readings on the diagnostic panel. They seemed low. And there was a faint vibration in the housing, inconsistent with the pump's RPM. It suggests a bearing is beginning to fail. Alistair stared at him. His multi-million-dollar, state-of-the-art system, monitored 24/7 by a team of experts, and a janitor had diagnosed a potential catastrophic failure just by looking at it. I'll have my engineers check it out, Alistair said, his voice neutral, betraying none of his shock. As he walked down the hallway, he knew two things for certain. First, Ivan Morozov was a wasted genius. And second, the mystery of his daughter was far from solved. It was leading him to a place where logic had no purchase, and he was starting to realize that to find the answer, he would have to do the one thing he feared most. He would have to learn to feel again. The first thing Alistair did upon returning to his office was call his head of engineering. I want a full diagnostic run on the Nexus cooling system, specifically the auxiliary pump on the primary loop. Check the bearings. Is there a problem, sir? All our readings are green. Just do it, Alistair ordered, and I want the report on my desk by the end of the day. He hung up and stood for a long time, looking at the chessboard Ivan had in his room. It reminded him of Anya. She had been a formidable player, a skill she'd said her father had taught her. She played with a fierce, intuitive style that often dismantled Alistair's more rigid, by-the-book strategies. He had sold her expensive hand-carved marble set after she died, unable to bear the sight of it. He regretted that now. That evening, he went home and found Lily in her playroom, a large, airy space filled with every toy a child could desire. She sat in the middle of the floor, not playing with any of them, just arranging colored blocks into a perfectly straight line. He sat on the floor a few feet away from her. He didn't speak, just watched. After a few minutes, he took a few blocks and began building a small tower. He didn't try to engage her, didn't ask for her help. He just built. He felt clumsy, foolish. This was not his world. But he stayed. For half an hour they sat in silence, engaged in their separate, parallel construction projects. Then, just as he was about to give up, Lily took one of her blocks, a red one, and placed it carefully on top of his tower. She didn't look at him. Her hand retreated as quickly as it had appeared, but it was a connection. A beginning. Alistair's heart swelled with a feeling so intense it almost hurt. The next day, two things happened. The first was the engineering report. The auxiliary pump bearing was showing signs of microscopic stress fractures, consistent with early-stage failure. If it had failed, the Nexus would have shut down, costing the company millions in downtime and potentially corrupting decades of research data. Alistair's engineers were baffled as to how the anomaly had been detected. The second was a phone call from Lily's school. The principal sounded concerned. "Mr. Finch, it's about Lily. She drew a picture in class today. Her teacher was a little worried by it." "Worried how?" Alistair asked, his stomach tightening. "It's a picture of a man. An old man. Lily has written a word over and over again next to his head." Alistair closed his eyes. "Let me guess. The word is dedushka." There was a surprised silence on the other end of the line. "Yes, that's it. Mr. Finch, is everything all right at home?" "Everything is fine," Alistair said, his voice tight. "I'll be there to pick her up myself." He drove to the school, his mind racing. Lily was not letting this go. The connection she had felt with Ivan was real, and it was powerful. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't rationalize it away. He had to embrace it, whatever it was. When he saw the drawing, it was even more jarring than he had imagined. It was a child's simple crayon sketch, but the likeness was unmistakable. It was Ivan, with his stooped shoulders and kind, sad eyes. And all around his head, in shaky, blocky letters, was the word, Dedushka, Dedushka, Dedushka. That night, Alistair made another call. "Mr. Morozov?" "It's Alistair Finch again." "Mr. Finch." Ivan's voice was warmer this time, less guarded. "Your diagnosis was correct. The pump bearing was failing. You may have saved my company a great deal of trouble." "I am glad my old eyes are still useful for something," Ivan said, a hint of pride in his voice. "That's not the only reason I'm calling," Alistair said, taking a breath. "I have a proposition for you. It's unconventional." He explained the situation with Lily, the silence, the drawing, her persistent, unspoken fixation on the old man. "I was wondering," Alistair finished, the words feeling strange and difficult. "I was wondering if you would be willing to see her again." There was a long pause. "Mr. Finch, I am a janitor. You are you. Your world and my world, they do not mix." "I'm not asking you to mix worlds," Alistair said. I'm asking you to help my daughter. I'll pay you, of course, whatever you think is fair. I do not want your money, Ivan said, a sudden firmness in his tone. If I do this, I do it for the child, not for pay. Alistair was taken aback. In his world, everyone had a price. All right, he said. No pay, but will you do it? Ivan sighed. To see the little one again, it would be a gift. But I worry. It may confuse her. It may bring more pain. I'm willing to take that risk, Alistair said. She's already in pain. This is the first time she's shown an interest in anything, in anyone, in 2 years. I have to follow this. So they made a plan. Ivan would come to Alistair's penthouse apartment the following Saturday. Not as a janitor, but as a guest. Alistair spent the rest of the week in a state of nervous anticipation. He was conducting an experiment with the most volatile, unpredictable elements imaginable. A traumatized child and a grieving old man. He was terrified of what might happen. He was even more terrified of what might not happen. When Saturday arrived, Alistair told Lily they were having a visitor. She showed no reaction. He had the housekeeper prepare tea and small cakes, the way Anya used to. The penthouse, usually so cold and minimalist, felt slightly warmer, filled with the scent of baking. At precisely 2 p.m., the doorbell chimed. Alistair's heart leapt. He opened the door to find Ivan standing there, looking deeply uncomfortable. He was wearing the same cardigan, but he held a small, awkwardly wrapped package in his hands. "Mr. Finch," he said, his eyes darting around the opulent entryway. "This place is like a palace. Please call me Alistair and come in." Alistair led him into the living room. Lily was on the floor, surrounded by her blocks. She looked up as they entered, her eyes widening slightly as she saw Ivan. She froze, a block held tightly in her hand. Ivan stopped a few feet away, his own expression one of gentle awe. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, a small, sad smile on his face. He knelt down, his old joints creaking, and placed the small package on the floor between them. "For you," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Lily stared at the package, then back at Ivan. She didn't move. Alistair held his breath. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He was about to intervene to say something to break the tension when Lily slowly, deliberately, put down the block she was holding. She crawled forward and picked up the package. Her small fingers fumbled with the wrapping paper. Inside was a small, hand-carved wooden bird. It was simple, but beautiful, its lines smooth and elegant. Lily traced the curve of its wing with her finger. She looked up at Ivan, a question in her eyes. Ivan smiled. "It is a jar ptitsa," he said, "a firebird, from an old story, a story my Anya loved." He began to tell the story, his voice a low melodic rumble. He spoke in a mixture of Russian and English, telling the tale of a magical bird that brought both fortune and trouble. Alistair, watching from the doorway, didn't understand all the words, but he understood the cadence, the rhythm of a fairy tale told 1,000 times. Lily listened, her dark eyes never leaving Ivan's face. She held the wooden bird tightly in her hand. For the first time in 2 years, the silence in the room didn't feel empty. It felt full of magic and memory, and the beginning of a strange, impossible friendship. That afternoon marked a sea change in Alistair's home. Ivan became a regular visitor. Twice a week, the old engineer would take the bus from his tenement building and ride the silent, high-speed elevator up to the penthouse. He never came empty-handed. Sometimes he brought another small carved toy, a bear, a wolf, a matryoshka doll he had painstakingly painted himself. Other times, he brought a book of Russian fairy tales, its pages worn and soft from countless readings. He and Lily developed their own ritual. They would sit on the floor of the playroom, and Ivan would speak to her in a soft mix of Russian and English. He never pushed her to respond. He simply shared his world with her. He taught her the Russian words for colors, for animals, for the simple things around them. Solntsy for sun, Derevo for tree, Petitza for the little wooden bird she now carried with her everywhere. Alastair became an observer in his own home. He would watch from a distance, amazed at the quiet, powerful bond forming between the two. With Ivan, Lily was a different child. She was still silent, but her silence was no longer vacant. It was attentive, engaged. She would point to things, her eyes asking questions that Ivan seemed to understand perfectly. He saw her smile, a genuine, unprompted smile, for the first time since Anya's funeral. It happened while Ivan was trying to show her a simple card trick, fumbling with the deck in his large, clumsy hands. He dropped the cards and they scattered across the floor. Lily didn't laugh out loud, but the corners of her mouth turned up in a silent, radiant arc of amusement. The sight of it made Alastair's throat ache. He began to change, too. He started leaving the office earlier on the days Ivan was scheduled to visit. He found himself lingering, listening to Ivan's stories, catching the Russian words and rolling them around in his mind. They were Anya's words, echoes of a part of his life he had tried to lock away. Ivan was inadvertently giving him back a piece of his wife. One afternoon, Alastair found Ivan alone in the living room, staring at the white grand piano. "My Elena, she played," Ivan said without turning around, not like a professional, but with heart. "This house, it is so quiet. It needs music." The next day, Alastair hired a piano tuner, and that evening he went into the storage unit where he kept the remnants of his life with Anya and unboxed her old sheet music. He placed a simple Tchaikovsky prelude on the piano. He didn't know if anyone would ever play it, but its presence felt important. It was an offering. His relationship with Ivan also deepened. They would talk after Lily had gone to bed, sitting in the vast living room, two solitary men from different worlds. Alastair learned more about Ivan's past, about the wife he had adored, and the daughter he had lost. Ivan, in turn, learned about the pressures and burdens of Alastair's empire. He was a surprisingly astute listener, his engineer's mind cutting through the complexities of finance and strategy to the simple, human core of the problem. "You have built a very tall tower, Alastair," Ivan said one evening, looking out at the city lights. "But a tall tower is a lonely place to live." Alastair couldn't argue. He also offered Ivan a job, a real job. "I want to create a position for you in the R&D department, a consultant. You could work on the Nexus systems. You have a talent for seeing things others miss." Ivan considered it for a long moment, swirling the tea in his cup. Then he shook his head. "Thank you, Alastair, it is a great honor. But my time for building such things is past. My work is with Lily." The refusal, so gentle yet so firm, stunned Alastair. He was offering the man a fortune, a return to the life he had lost. And Ivan had turned it down for the sake of a silent little girl. It was a choice so completely outside of Alastair's own value system that it fundamentally shifted his perspective. He was beginning to understand that there were currencies more valuable than money. But the fragile peace of their new arrangement was soon threatened. The world Alastair had built, with its ruthless rules and constant competition, intruded. A story was leaked to a notorious financial gossip blog. The headline was sensational. "Tycoon Alastair Finch's mysterious new guru, a janitor." The article was a snide, insinuating piece, painting a picture of an eccentric, possibly unstable billionaire taking life advice from a lowly cleaner. It hinted that Finch's judgment was failing, that his company was vulnerable. Alastair was furious. It was a calculated attack by a business rival, designed to rattle investors and sow doubt. His PR team went into overdrive. Their advice was unanimous: cut ties with the janitor immediately, issue a statement, control the narrative. "You have to get rid of him, Alastair," his chief counsel advised. "The optics are a disaster. It makes you look weak." Alastair sat in his office, the offending article glowing on his monitor, the voices of his advisors ringing in his ears. The old Alastair would have agreed without hesitation. He would have cut Ivan loose, written a large check to soothe his conscience, and moved on. It would have been the logical, strategic move. But he wasn't the old Alastair. He thought of Lily's smile. He thought of the wooden firebird she slept with every night. He thought of the quiet dignity of the old man who had turned down a fortune to help a child. He swiveled his chair to face the window. He saw the city, his kingdom, sprawling below. For years he had fought to conquer it, to control it. Now he saw it differently. It wasn't a kingdom to be ruled. It was just a collection of towers filled with people trying to find their way. He buzzed his assistant. "Cancel my afternoon meetings and get my car. I'm going home." When he walked into the penthouse, he found Ivan and Lily sitting at the small table by the window. They weren't playing or reading. They were working on a puzzle together, a large, complex image of a forest. They worked in comfortable silence, their hands occasionally brushing as they reached for the same piece. Alastair walked over and sat down with them. He didn't say anything about the article. He didn't say anything about the crisis at his company. He just picked up a puzzle piece and found its place along the border. The three of them sat there for the rest of the afternoon, in the quiet, sunlit room, piecing together a fractured world. And Alastair knew, with a certainty that transcended all logic and strategy, that he was not going to fire Ivan. He was not going to hide him. He was going to do the opposite. He was going to fight for him. He was going to fight for this strange, broken, beautiful family they were building. The next morning, Alastair called a press conference. The room was packed with reporters, the air buzzing with the electronic chirp of cameras and whispered speculation. Alastair Finch, who hadn't held an open press conference in 5 years, was about to address the rumors. He walked to the podium, not with his usual aggressive confidence, but with a quiet, calm resolve. He looked out at the sea of faces and began to speak. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady. "I'm sure you've all read the recent stories about my association with a man named Ivan Morozov. The stories are true. He was a janitor in my building. He is now one of my closest and most trusted friends." A murmur went through the room. Alastair held up a hand. "You've been led to believe this is a story about a powerful man losing his mind. You're wrong. This is a story about a man finding it." He then told them about Ivan. He didn't mention Lily or the details of their family tragedy. He spoke of Ivan the engineer, the forgotten genius. He told them about the Nexus cooling pump, how Ivan's quiet observation had saved the company millions. He announced the creation of a new, independent foundation, funded personally by him, dedicated to helping skilled immigrants and refugees who were underemployed, to connect them with industries that desperately needed their expertise. "Mr. Morozov will be the first person I ask to sit on its board," Alastair declared. "Our society is wasting its most valuable resource, people. We look at a man's uniform and we judge him. We see a janitor. I've learned to see the genius inside. I suggest we all start looking a little closer." He ended the press conference without taking questions, leaving a room of stunned reporters. The story was no longer a gossip piece about an eccentric billionaire. It was now a story of redemption, innovation, and philanthropy. Alastair had not just controlled the narrative, he had rewritten it completely. When he returned to the penthouse that evening, he found Ivan waiting for him. The old man was holding a tablet, his face pale. He had watched the press conference. "Alastair," he said, his voice trembling, "what you said, what you are doing, why?" Alastair walked over to the window and looked down at the city. "Because you were right, Ivan," he said. "It's a lonely place to live in a tall tower. I'm tired of being lonely." He turned to face him. "And besides," he added, a small smile playing on his lips, "it was a good business decision. That foundation is going to find me a dozen genius just like you. My competitors won't know what hit them." Ivan stared at him for a moment, and then he began to laugh. It was a deep, rusty sound, a laugh that hadn't been used in a long, long time. And as Alistair listened, he felt the last of the ice around his heart finally melt away. Life in the penthouse settled into a new, quiet rhythm. The foundation became Alistair's new passion project, and true to his word, it began to uncover extraordinary talents hidden in plain sight. A Syrian surgeon working as a taxi driver, a Venezuelan chemist stocking shelves in a grocery store, a Ukrainian architect working in construction. Alistair's company reaped the benefits, but for him, the real reward was the work itself. It was the first thing he had ever built that wasn't about profit, but about potential. Ivan was a constant, steady presence. He never took an official role at the foundation, refusing any title or salary, but he became its heart. He would meet with the candidates, his gentle manner and shared experience allowing him to connect with them in a way Alistair never could. He was a living testament to the Foundation's mission, but his most important work remained with Lily. He continued to visit, to tell his stories, to teach her his language. The bond between them was the quiet, solid bedrock upon which everything else was being built. Then one evening, on the second anniversary of Anya's death, the miracle they had stopped waiting for happened. Alistair, Ivan, and Lily were in the living room. Alistair had been telling Lily stories about her mother, something he now did regularly. He had just finished a story about how Anya had loved to go to the ballet. Lily had been listening intently, the little wooden firebird clutched in her hand. She looked from her father to Ivan, and then down at the bird. She took a deep breath. "Mama," she said, her voice small and slightly hoarse from disuse. "Mama loved the pititsa." Alistair and Ivan froze, their eyes locking over Lily's head. Tears welled in Alistair's eyes. Ivan reached out and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Lily looked up at her father's face, a flicker of concern in her eyes. "Papa?" she asked, the word a perfect, beautiful question. Alistair knelt and pulled her into a fierce hug, burying his face in her hair. He was crying, not with grief, but with a joy so profound it was painful. Over her shoulder, he met Ivan's gaze. The old man was smiling, his own tears tracing paths through the wrinkles on his cheeks. From that day on, Lily began to talk. It started as a trickle, then became a steady stream. She spoke a unique blend of English and Russian, her sentences peppered with the words Ivan had taught her. The penthouse, once a bastion of silence, was now filled with the sound of a child's chatter, with questions and stories and laughter. A few months later, Alistair was going through the last of Anya's boxes from the storage unit. At the very bottom of a trunk, beneath a pile of her old university textbooks, he found a small, locked metal box. He had never seen it before. He forced the lock, and his breath caught in his throat. Inside was a bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon, and a photograph. The photograph was of a young, smiling Anya, standing with her arm around another girl who looked almost identical to her. They were clearly sisters. Twins. The letters, written in Russian, were from her sister. Alistair spent the entire night with an online translator, painstakingly piecing together the story. His wife, Anya, had not been an orphan. She had a twin sister, Katya, and their parents had not died in a car accident. Their father, a brilliant engineer, had gotten into trouble with the government for his political dissent. He had been sent to a labor camp, and their mother had died of a broken heart shortly after. The two girls, just children, were sent to a state orphanage. The story Anya had told him was a lie, but it was a lie born of trauma and a fierce desire to protect herself, to erase a past that was too painful to carry. As they grew older, the sisters chose different paths. Anya was ambitious, desperate to escape. She earned a scholarship to study in America. Katya was a homebody, deeply attached to her roots. She stayed in Russia. She married a local boy. She had a daughter who looked just like her and just like her Aunt Anya. A daughter named Lily. The final letter was dated just before Anya had met Alistair. Katya wrote that her husband had been killed in a factory accident. She was sick, she wrote, a congenital heart condition, and she was worried about her daughter. She had no one else. Anya, living in America, had sent money, but it was never enough. Then the letters stopped. Alistair sat in the pre-dawn light, the letters spread around him, his world completely upended for the second time. His Lily was not his biological daughter. She was his niece. Anya, unable to have children of her own due to the same heart condition that had likely claimed her sister, had done something extraordinary. She had gone back to Russia, to a dying sister, and had brought her child back to America, raising her as her own. She had never told him. Perhaps she was afraid he would reject the child. Perhaps she thought it was a secret too heavy to share. Alistair looked at the photograph of the two sisters, so alike, and felt nothing but awe for the woman he had married. She had not been a liar. She had been a hero, driven by a love so powerful it had bent reality to its will. But there was one piece of the puzzle that still didn't fit. The grandfather. If even Morozov's daughter had died as a teenager, then who was the grandfather Anya had always talked about? The engineer who taught her chess and told her stories. He picked up the first letter again. In it, Katya mentioned the old man who lived in the apartment below them, a former engineer who had lost his own family. He was kind to the girls, she wrote. He looked out for them after their parents were gone. He taught them to play chess. He was like a grandfather to them. They called him Dedushka. Alistair finally understood. Ivan Morozov had been the girls' surrogate grandfather. He had loved them both. And when he had arrived in America years later, a broken man, he had taken a janitor's job in a tower, completely unaware that in the penthouse lived the daughter of one of his adopted granddaughters and a little girl who carried the face of the other. The coincidence was not a coincidence at all. It was a thread of human connection, stretching across decades and continents, across tragedy and loss. A thread that had finally, impossibly, pulled them all together. The next day, he sat down with Ivan and showed him the letters and the photograph. He watched as the old man's eyes widened in recognition, as the dawning understanding brought tears to his eyes. Katya, Ivan whispered, tracing the face in the photograph. And Anyushka, my little birds. He had thought he had lost them both, to find that a part of them had survived, had ended up here, in this tower, with him. It was a gift too great to comprehend. That evening, the three of them sat together, and Alistair, with Ivan's help, told Lily the whole story. He showed her the picture of her mother, Katya, and her Aunt Anya. He told her about the brave, loving woman who had brought her to a new home, and he told her about the kind man who had been a grandfather to them both long ago, in a faraway land. Lily listened, her dark eyes filled with a solemn, child's wisdom. She looked at the picture, at the two smiling faces, and then she looked at Alistair and at Ivan. She reached out and took both of their hands. "My papa," she said, squeezing Alistair's hand. Then she looked at Ivan, her expression filled with a love that transcended memory and logic. "And my Dedushka," she said, her voice clear and strong. The tower was no longer a lonely place. It was a home. It wasn't a perfect traditional home, but it was a home nonetheless, built on a foundation of secrets and sorrow, but held together by the fierce, resilient mortar of love. Alistair Finch, the billionaire, Ivan Morozov, the janitor, and Lily, the little girl who remembered a love she had never known, had found their way to each other, a strange and wonderful constellation in the vast, glittering city skyline. They were a family, and they were finally whole.